Today's episode of Today in World War II, April 9th, German troops crossed into Denmark. In Trondheim, German warships sail right past the coastal defenses and take the city. Oslo puts up more of a fight than Trondheim did. Meanwhile, the Norwegian royal family flees the country with all their gold. In uh, Over England, RAF Ace Roland Robert Stanford Tuck shoots down a Ju-88. The Japanese continue their assault on Ceylon with their aircraft carriers, sinking a British carrier. Uh, the American and Filipino troops in Bataan finally surrender. And de Gaulle, good for him. De Gaulle wins the power struggle and becomes commander-in-chief of the Free French. And the Red Army defeats the Germans in East Prussia finally, after a long resistance, and this frees up the Belarusian front to move forward. Lots of stuff happening. Let's just dive into it, okay? So on April 9th, 1940, German troops crossed into Denmark at about 5 in the morning, and by dinner time, it was all over. Their landings were unopposed. The Danish government surrendered within, the same day. And I think the Germans only lost well, they had 20 casualties. I'm not sure how many were killed and how many were wounded. But there was never any chance the Danes were going to be able to resist longer than they did. What can you do, right? I mean, the Colossus can just easily cross your land border, and there was no way. So, but Denmark did resist, and their resistance force was pretty good. Now, as we'll see in this video series in the future, we're going to see how the Danes were treated with kid gloves initially, but they resisted. The king resisted. He didn't leave like the Norwegian people. He stayed. He could not leave his people. And it was very brave on his part. So I personally, as a World War II nerd and someone who loves to read about the resistance movements in occupied territory, the Danes did some really, really amazing things, including, as we're going to see later in the year, getting most of their Jews out of uh, Denmark to Sweden to save them from the Holocaust. So that alone gives me, that puts them right up there in the Hall of Fame in the top three, as far as I'm concerned. On April 9th, 1940, we're continuing the invasion of Norway. The Germans at Trondheim, they just went right through. They pretended to be British ships. The coastal batteries were confused and did not fire a shot, which meant that Trondheim was taken just like that. And why is that important? Well, of course, anytime you take a major port, a major strategic city, it's a big deal. But now the Germans had control of the airfields. They could bring the Luftwaffe into those airfields and use that as a base to attack the other places that didn't give up without a fight, which is what we're going to see here. Uh, let's go to Oslo. In Oslo, it was a heavier fight for the Germans. They just weren't able to sail into Oslo and take over. The coastal batteries there actually sank a German cruiser, the Blucher, and it killed about 830 sailors. It didn't prevent them from being conquered, but at least they got some payback and didn't make it easy for the Germans. Now, meantime, while this is all going on, the Norwegian royal family and the government and the certain parts of the military, they fled to eventually they made it to the UK, and they took with them over 48 tons of gold. And I tell you what, they bugged out pretty quickly. The invasion happened around like first thing in the morning. By 8:30, they were gone. So, good for them. There's a very good PBS Masterpiece has a very good series called Atlantic Crossing. It talks a lot about the Norwegians. And the first few episodes talks about how that was like the invasion and so on and so forth. So it was very good. On April 9th, 1941, my personal favorite RAF ace, Roland Robert Stanford Tuck, shot down a Ju-88 in a night engagement over East Anglia. It's interesting that Tuck actually had quite a few victories as a night fighter. And I think, believe at this time he was flying Hurricanes. And so he was, he worked very closely with air control to make these interceptions at night because you needed to have very good coordination between the fighter pilot and control because the fighter pilot was flying blind. There was no onboard radar, not in a hurricane at least. So he talked about that in his book about how in 1941 the controlling started to get much better, and sometimes they would direct him right to the bomber. And you think about this: you got a pitch black night. The only thing you can see is maybe some exhaust, or some exhaust flames coming from the engine, very small. And he got a number of victories in these types of situations. So I think that also has to do with him. He was such a great pilot and such a wonderful marksman. I mean, he was a champion skeet shooter. So he knew. I mean, he once he had like a boom, a quick snapshot, he could put his guns to the engine of a bomber and shoot it down quickly. So good for him. Another reason why I think he's one of the best fighter pilots the RAF ever had. On April 9th, 1942, Kiribati, or Butai, I'm not sure how they pronounce that, the Japanese strike carrier force was still making hay in Ceylon. Sri Lanka is what we call it now. They attacked the harbor of Trincomalee in Ceylon, and they sank a British aircraft carrier, the Hermes. And like I said, in I believe yesterday or the day before is the report, it caused the British Admiral Somerville to withdraw the Royal Navy all the way back to Kenya. So the Japanese, with this one raid, were kicked all the way out of the Indian Ocean, pretty much. But again, what was the point? Okay, the British were not they were not a threat. The Japanese, it was just a raid. They did not want to invade and take over Ceylon. So all it meant was just more time without rest and maintenance and recuperation for Kiribati, which had been going nonstop since before Pearl Harbor. Sadly, on April 9th, 1942, the U.S. and Philippine troops, the remainder of the U.S. Second Corps, under General King on the Bataan Peninsula, were forced to surrender to the Japanese. Yesterday, I told you that the Japanese had penetrated two defense lines. They were on quarter at rations to begin with. They were walking skeletons, and they just couldn't do it anymore. And so this was the largest surrender in American history, 75,000 U.S. and Filipino troops. They held out as long as they could, and they held out longer than anybody else in the first 6 months of the war. But all things break eventually, and they did. On April 9th, 1944, Charles de Gaulle wins the infighting between him and Henri Girard. They were vying to become the um, uh, commander-in-chief of the Free French Forces. They had become pro or co-presidents of the National or the French Committee of the National Liberation, but then de Gaulle was able to elbow him out in a very French way. He sacre bleu. But I love the French, by the way. I really do. And so he became the commander. I think he was the correct one. He had the personality, he had the prestige, and people would follow him. You know, I don't know. He had a lot of faults, but then again, everybody has faults, right? But he did a good job. And finally, on April 9th, 1945, Red Army, after a long struggle with the Germans in East Prussia, because remember, the Germans were defending their homeland as far as they were concerned. East Prussia was, they felt it was German territory, and so they fought very hard. But on today's date, they finally snuffed out all the resistance. And this was important because this freed up the Second Belarusian Front to move west. And what's west? What's waiting for them there? The Pearl, as far as the Soviets were concerned, it was Berlin. Well, I want to thank you for watching this video today again, and I will see you tomorrow.